In the last hour, Democrats in Congress have formally introduced an article of impeachment against President Trump, charging him with incitement of insurrection for his role in the events leading up to the storming of the US Capitol building 5 days ago. It's just 9 days until the inauguration of Joe Biden as president. Democrats have also put forward a resolution demanding that the Vice President, Mike Pence, and the rest of the cabinet strip Donald Trump of his presidential powers.
Well, Republicans have blocked the request for now, but it could be voted on as early as Tuesday. If that fails, Democrats have warned they'll move to impeach the president for a second time. President Trump has been accused of inciting his supporters to attack Congress last Wednesday to try to overturn Joe Biden's election victory back in November.
Well, let's speak now to Gary O'Donoghue, who is on Capitol Hill for us. And Gary, Democrats have released this article of impeachment against President Trump. What exactly are they accusing him of?
All right, everyone. Dr. John here. So what's happening right now, Republicans and Democrats are standing together on Capitol Hill demanding Trump's immediate impeachment and removal. Not after hearings, not after investigations, right now. The bipartisan urgency and visible panic tells you this is something beyond a typical political standoff. Picture what's happening right now. The Capitol complex.
Just to be clear, I'm in downtown Washington, not on the Hill, but what they're saying is that the president is responsible for inciting insurrection, that his words, his actions, particularly last week ahead of that attack on the Capitol, were an attempt really at a coup. And that's what they're planning to vote on, possibly as early as Wednesday, Laura. That article of impeachment could be voted on, depending what happens with this other resolution on the 25th Amendment. And then there'll be a question, because the Democrats obviously do have the majority, they have the numbers in the House to get an article through by a simple majority. Then there'll be the question about when and how they sent that article of impeachment to the Senate.
And there's some talk, isn't there, Gary, that it could potentially be that Democrats wait until after Joe Biden's first 100 days as president before they send those articles of impeachment to the Senate. So is there a split among Democrats about how to proceed here?
Usually a place of orderly procedure and carefully scripted press availabilities has transformed into something that resembles a pressure cooker about to blow its lid. Lawmakers are shouting from the podiums. Emergency press conferences are being convened one after another with barely enough time to reset the microphones between speakers. Massive crowds of demonstrators have descended upon the Capitol steps, their chants echoing through the marble corridors inside.
I think there's a potential split here because the Senate is obliged to take up these articles as soon as they receive them and move to a trial. And of course, that first 100 days, now that the Biden administration has some semblance of control of the Senate with the 50-50 split and the casting vote of the vice president, they'll want to use those first 100 days to their full effect, not least to get his cabinet and his other picks confirmed for the executive branch, but also to begin the process of legislation. So they won't want to, in a sense, waste it, if you like, if I can put it that way, on a long and drawn out trial. They could delay that trial for months. Laura, what will be the point of it? Well, of course, it wouldn't remove the president from office because he'll have already been long gone. But it would be, if they can get the Republicans to support it, a conviction. And that's quite important in itself, but also it would prevent Donald Trump from standing for federal office in future and rule out any possibility of that fabled 2024 run.
Gary, is there really any Republican support for impeaching the president?
Barricades that haven't been seen since some of the darkest days in recent American history are being erected once again. Security personnel are everywhere, their faces tense, their movements urgent. National and international media outlets have parked their satellite trucks in every available space, running live feeds around the clock because nobody wants to miss even a single moment of what's developing. This is not a drill. This is not a routine legislative day.
Democrats certainly hope that there will be. There have been one or two rumblings. One or two Republicans in the House have indicated they might be open to it. That we've seen a few senators, 2 or 3 senators, who have called on President Trump to resign. Would they then go along with an impeachment idea? You'll remember, of course, Mitt Romney in the last impeachment trial that Donald Trump faced did vote for one of those articles of impeachment. So there's a history of one Republican in the Senate, for example, supporting at least one article of impeachment. Democrats would love it to be, to some extent, bipartisan, because in the House last time around, they got not one single Republican vote.
Well, let's continue to analyse events. Let's turn to the security side of it. Let's speak to Kori Sharkey, who's the Director of Foreign and Defence Policy at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you so much for being here on the programme. Your take at those developments in the last hour or so on the floor of the House, the various options put forward, what we're likely to see in the coming days. Give me your assessment.
This is the American political system facing a moment of maximum stress, and everyone involved knows it. Inside the hallowed chambers, articles of impeachment have been formally and urgently filed. These are not draft documents being circulated for discussion. These are signed, delivered, ready-to-vote articles that lay out a devastating case against the sitting president. The charges are multiple and they are severe. Constitutional violations that go to the very heart of what it means to be president. Obstruction of justice on a scale that prosecutors could only dream of proving in a criminal case.
My assessment is that it's unlikely the president will resign. It's unlikely that the invocation of the 25th Amendment will happen. It's extremely likely that the House of Representatives will vote to impeach the president. So in order to hold President Trump accountable. And then I think, as your correspondent said, there will be a decision about when to hold the Senate trial. And my guess is they'll probably let the trial slip until after they have they've held hearings and confirmed President-elect Biden's cabinet.
And Kori, as we see more and more images, more and more footage of that storming of the US Capitol building, and I was there outside and it was shocking enough from the outside, what is your sense of how organised this may have been?
Defiance of Supreme Court rulings, which is itself a direct assault on the separation of powers that has kept this republic functioning for nearly 2.5 centuries. And layered on top of all of that, the latest revelations pouring out of Justice Department investigations. Revelations that have apparently convinced even some of Trump's most loyal defenders that the line has finally been crossed. These articles of impeachment don't just accuse Trump of making mistakes or exercising poor judgment.
Much more organized than I think we initially thought. You can see in some video lines of men in military gear moving into the Capitol. The fact that they had zip ties to take hostages, I think, is extraordinarily worrisome. While a lot of the mob appeared to be having fun, thinking this was great. And several of the people who've been identified as being in the Capitol are acting like they were just caught in the wrong moment. And that's clearly not true. People made choices. They bought airplane and bus tickets. They elected to break windows and threaten members of Congress. I mean, I think we shouldn't be at all hesitant to call this what it was. The President of the United States inciting a mob to violence to threaten members of Congress in an effort to prevent them from...
They paint a picture of a president who has systematically and deliberately placed himself above the law, who has treated the Constitution as an inconvenience rather than a binding framework, and who, in the assessment of these lawmakers, must be stopped before he inflicts damage that can never be repaired. Now let me tell you why this moment is fundamentally different from everything that came before it. The United States has impeached Donald Trump twice already. Those were historic events in their own right. But both of those previous impeachments followed a predictable, almost scripted pattern. Democrats pushed for accountability. Republicans circled the wagons. The votes fell largely along party lines. A handful of defectors made headlines, but the overall dynamic was unmistakably partisan. Trump survived both times by dismissing the whole thing as a political witch hunt, and his base accepted that framing because, honestly, when only one party is coming after you, the claim of partisanship has at least surface-level plausibility. But what's happening right now shatters that pattern completely. This impeachment effort is bipartisan in a way that rewrites the political playbook. Republican lawmakers, people who defended Trump through every previous scandal, who stood by him during controversies that would have destroyed any other political career, are now breaking ranks publicly and emphatically. They're not mumbling quiet concerns behind closed doors. They're not leaking anonymous quotes to friendly reporters. They are standing at microphones, looking into cameras, and telling the American people that enough is enough. That this president, their party's president, has gone too far. That the constitutional violations have become too severe to ignore. That the obstruction of justice has become too blatant to excuse. That the defiance of court orders has become too dangerous to tolerate. Listen to the language these Republican lawmakers are using. They're not hedging. They're not couching their statements in careful political ambiguity. They're being direct, blunt, almost brutal in their honesty about what they believe is at stake. They're talking about constitutional breakdown as a real and immediate possibility. They're warning of irreparable damage to American democracy if Congress fails to act decisively. These are not words chosen lightly by politicians who understand that every public statement will be preserved forever and used against them in future primary campaigns. When lawmakers start using phrases like irreparable damage to the republic, they've moved beyond political calculation into something much more fundamental. They've concluded that the survival of the constitutional system itself is on the line, and that their oath of office leaves them no choice but to act, regardless of the political consequences. Some of them are undoubtedly ending their careers by taking this stand. They know that. They've said as much in interviews, and they're doing it anyway because they genuinely believe, that the alternative is watching the entire framework of American governance collapse under the weight of presidential lawlessness. The numbers tell their own story, and it's a story that should make everyone sit up and pay attention. More than 120 members of the House of Representatives have now publicly declared their support for impeachment. That's a substantial block, more than enough to create serious momentum, but what makes it remarkable is the composition. These aren't just Democrats doing what Democrats have always done. There are Republicans in that number, multiple Republicans who have looked at the evidence, assessed the situation, and concluded that their party loyalty cannot extend to defending the indefensible. And in the Senate, where conviction requires a two-thirds supermajority that has never been achieved in any presidential impeachment trial, at least 7 Republican senators have already signaled their willingness to consider removal. 7. That number may not sound like much, but in the context of Senate impeachment trials, it represents a seismic shift. Remember, during the first Trump impeachment trial, only one Republican senator, Mitt Romney, voted to convict on even a single article. Now we're talking about 7 who are publicly open to removal, with more potentially waiting in the wings, watching to see how the evidence unfolds during trial, ready to join if the case proves as damning as the articles suggest. And here's the thing about those numbers, they're not static, they're growing by the hour. Every time a new detail emerges from the Justice Department evidence troves, every time another Supreme Court ruling strips away another layer of Trump's immunity defenses, every time a federal judge issues another contempt warning, more lawmakers reach their breaking point. The dam isn't just leaking anymore, it's developing cracks that are spreading in every direction. Lawmakers who have remained silent for months are suddenly finding their voices. Staffers are fielding calls from constituents demanding to know why their representative hasn't taken a position yet. The pressure is building from every direction simultaneously, and the structural integrity of Trump's congressional support is deteriorating in real time. What the lawmakers demanding immediate action want is simple in concept, but extraordinary in practice. They want to skip the usual drawn-out process. No more months of committee hearings, no more endless deliberations about procedure and precedent, no more delays designed to run out the clock. They want the articles of impeachment brought directly to the House floor for an immediate up or down vote. Every member of Congress forced to stand up and be counted, every vote recorded for history to judge. Every representative required to look their constituents in the eye, either in person or through the unforgiving lens of C-SPAN cameras, and explain why they stood for accountability or why they chose to defend conduct that multiple federal judges have already deemed beyond the pale. That's the demand echoing through the Capitol corridors right now. No hiding, no procedural escape hatches, no running out the clock, just a straight vote on whether the evidence warrants removing this president from power. The atmosphere at the Capitol complex is something something you genuinely cannot understand unless you're witnessing it firsthand or watching the live feeds with the sound turned up. The crowds outside have grown to proportions that have security officials visibly nervous. Some demonstrators are there to support Trump, waving flags and chanting about witch hunts and deep state conspiracies. Others are there demanding accountability, carrying signs calling for impeachment and removal, their voices hoarse from hours of protest. The two groups are separated by barricades and police lines, but the tension between them crackles in the air like static electricity before a lightning strike. Everyone remembers what happened the last time a massive crowd gathered at the Capitol with Trump at the center of controversy. Nobody wants a repeat of that. Security has been layered upon security, additional fencing, more officers, contingency plans for every imaginable scenario. The whole apparatus of Capitol protection is operating at maximum alert, and still there's an undercurrent of anxiety that nobody can quite shake. Inside the building, the scene is equally intense. Lawmakers who have served for decades say they've never seen anything like it. The hallways are packed with staffers rushing documents between offices. Reporters are camped out in every available corner, doing live hits for networks around the world. Small groups of representatives huddle in whispered conversations, counting votes, assessing who might flip next, trying to game out exactly how this plays. Every few minutes, another lawmaker steps to a microphone somewhere in the building and delivers an impassioned statement about constitutional duty, about the rule of law, about the solemn obligation they swore to uphold. Some of these statements are angry, some are sorrowful. A few have been genuinely emotional, with lawmakers choking up as they describe their love for the country and their fear for its immediate future. This is not performative. Whatever you think of politicians generally, the raw emotion on display right now is real. These are people who genuinely believe they are living through a hinge point in American history, and they're not wrong. The convergence of factors that brought us to this moment is almost overwhelming to catalog. Start with the Supreme Court rulings. The highest court in the land, including justices appointed by Trump himself, have systematically dismantled his claims of presidential immunity. Decision after decision has made clear that the president is not a monarch, that executive power has limits, that court orders must be obeyed, that the rule of law applies to everyone, including the person temporarily occupying the Oval Office. Each ruling has been a body blow to Trump's legal defenses. Each one has provided new ammunition for lawmakers who were already leaning toward impeachment. And critically, each one has been defied, dismissed, or ignored by Trump and his legal team, which has only made the case for removal more urgent. When a president treats Supreme Court decisions as optional suggestions rather than binding commands, the constitutional order itself begins to fracture. Then there's the evidence flowing from the special counsel investigations. Jack Smith's team has been methodically assembling a record that multiple legal experts have described as devastating. We're not talking about speculation or hearsay or the testimony of witnesses who might have credibility problems. We're talking about documentary evidence, official communications, records maintained by federal agencies with chain of custody protocols designed for courtroom durability, timestamps and digital signatures that make authenticity challenges nearly impossible. This is the kind of evidence that prosecutors build entire careers around, and according to multiple reports, it paints a picture of conduct that goes far beyond what was previously known. The details that have leaked into public view have been enough to shift the calculations of lawmakers who have spent years defending Trump against every accusation imaginable. When evidence of this quality surfaces, when it's authenticated and submitted to the court, the political ground shifts beneath everyone's feet. Add to this the contempt warnings coming from multiple federal judges who have grown visibly frustrated with what they perceive as deliberate stonewalling and defiance. Judges who have started using words like willful and flagrant to describe the conduct they're seeing. Judges who have threatened sanctions that would have been unthinkable in any previous administration, including the possibility of jail time for contempt. When federal judges start talking about jailing the president's attorneys for their conduct in court, the system is sending a signal that cannot be ignored. These judges are not political actors. They're not elected officials worried about the next election. They're lifetime appointees whose only currency is their legal reasoning and their institutional credibility. When they start sounding alarms, when they start using the strongest language available to them, people pay attention. Members of Congress certainly pay attention. And then there are the asset seizures and financial penalties that have started to bite. Court-ordered enforcement actions that have moved from theoretical possibilities to practical realities. Assets frozen, bank accounts encumbered, financial consequences that can't be spun away with a press release or a social media post. For a businessman president whose entire identity has been built around wealth and success and winning, these financial penalties cut in a way that legal arguments sometimes don't. They're tangible, they're undeniable, and they've added another layer of pressure to an already pressurized situation. Lawmakers watching this unfold have seen a president increasingly consumed by legal battles, increasingly distracted from the actual work of governing, increasingly willing to push boundaries and test limits in ways that alarm even his allies. All of these factors have combined to create a situation where Republican lawmakers, people who have every political incentive to keep defending Trump, have started jumping ship, and they're being remarkably candid about why. They're saying publicly what they used to only say privately, that the conduct they're seeing is indefensible, that the constitutional violations are too serious to overlook, that their oath to the Constitution means more than their loyalty to any individual, even the leader of their party. Some of them have talked about their children, about what kind of country they want to leave behind, about whether they want to be remembered as people who stood up for the rule of law or people who enabled its destruction. These are the kinds of reflections that politicians usually keep to themselves, but the gravity of this moment has pulled them into public view. These lawmakers are scared, not necessarily scared of Trump or of primary challenges, though those fears certainly exist. They're scared of what happens to the country if they fail to act. They're scared that history will judge them harshly if they had the opportunity to stop a constitutional crisis and chose to look the other way. The parliamentary mechanics of how this will work are worth understanding, because the process matters almost as much as the outcome. Impeachment in the House requires a simple majority vote. If more than half of the members present and voting support the articles, Trump is impeached, again, for the third time. That vote seems increasingly certain given the number of public commitments already made. The real drama will be in the Senate. Conviction and removal require 2/3 of the senators present. That's 67 if all 100 senators are there. Historically, that threshold has been impossible to reach. Presidents have been impeached before, but never convicted and removed. The numbers were never there. But right now, with 7 Republican senators already indicating they might vote to convict, the math is no longer absurd. It would require essentially every Democrat plus those 7 Republicans, and possibly a few more who haven't yet announced their position. That's a heavy lift. It's not the most likely outcome. But for the first time in American history, it's genuinely plausible that a president could be removed through the impeachment process. The fact that we're even discussing this as a real possibility tells you how extraordinary this moment has become. And if conviction actually happens, the consequences are immediate and absolute. There's no appeals process, no Supreme Court review, no do-over. The moment the Senate votes to convict, Trump is removed from office. The vice president is sworn in as president. The transition of power in a constitutional sense happens instantly. The removed president loses all authority, all privileges, all access to the levers of executive power. And the Senate could take an additional vote to bar him from ever holding federal office again, ensuring that this chapter of American political history is permanently closed. That's the end game. That's what the lawmakers pushing for impeachment are actually trying to achieve. Not just a symbolic rebuke, not just a mark on a legacy. Actual removal from power through the constitutional mechanism designed for exactly this purpose. But here's where the uncertainty gets genuinely frightening. What happens if Trump refuses to accept removal? What if he claims the impeachment was illegitimate, that the votes were coerced, that the deep state orchestrated the whole thing? What if he simply declines to leave the White House? This is the nightmare scenario that constitutional scholars have been whispering about for years. A president who has been constitutionally removed, but who rejects the legitimacy of that removal. A situation where the legal president and the former president both claim authority. A crisis that would have to be resolved through means that no one wants to contemplate. The Secret Service would face an impossible dilemma. Federal agencies would have to choose which president to obey. The military would have to determine where its constitutional obligations actually lie. This is the kind of scenario that happens in fragile democracies overseas, not in the United States of America. And yet, here we are, discussing it as a genuine possibility because the person at the center of this crisis has demonstrated repeatedly that he does not accept outcomes he doesn't like. The likely scenario, if conviction actually occurs, is that Trump would ultimately have no choice but to leave. The institutions of government, including the military and law enforcement, are sworn to the Constitution, not to any individual. Once the vice president is sworn in, the new president becomes the commander-in-chief. The chain of command shifts. Federal agencies answer to the new leadership. Trump might kick and scream and tweet and rally his supporters, but he wouldn't have the institutional power to actually maintain control. The machinery of government would move on without him, as it's designed to do. But the period between removal and acceptance could be incredibly dangerous. Protests could turn violent. Supporters could mobilize. The uncertainty itself, even if it's ultimately resolved peacefully, could do lasting damage to public confidence in democratic institutions. That's part of what's at stake here. Not just the removal of one president, but the question of whether the system can handle that removal smoothly, peacefully, constitutionally. The media dimension of all this amplifies everything. Every development is covered in real time. Every speech is broadcast live. Every rumor and leak gets picked up and dissected across platforms. The information environment is saturated with analysis, commentary, speculation, and outright misinformation. People are choosing their own facts, their own narratives, their own interpretations. And the divide between those interpretations is almost unbridgeable. One half of the country sees a long overdue accountability moment. The other half sees a coup dressed up in legal language. Both sides are absolutely certain they're right. Both sides have media ecosystems that reinforce their certainty. And in the middle, there's a shrinking group of exhausted Americans who just want to know if the system still works, if the rules still matter, if anything that happens in Washington has any connection to their actual lives. The international community is watching with a mixture of fascination and alarm. American allies are worried about what this means for global stability, for treaty commitments, for the reliability of American leadership. American adversaries are taking notes, looking for opportunities to exploit, calculating how a distracted and divided America changes the geopolitical landscape. The image of the United States as a stable, mature democracy has been taking hits for years. This moment, whatever the outcome, will either partially restore that image or further damage it. The world is watching to see whether the American system can actually enforce its own rules against its most powerful person. That's a test that most countries never face. And honestly, most countries that do face it don't pass. So here's where things stand right now. The House appears poised to vote on articles of impeachment. The votes for impeachment seem to be there, possibly with enough bipartisan support to make it undeniably legitimate in a way previous impeachments weren't. The Senate is the real question mark. 7 Republican senators are publicly in play. More might be privately considering their options. The trial, if it happens, will be unlike anything we've seen before. The evidence will be presented. The arguments will be made. Senators will have to sit in silence and listen. No phones, no staff, no escape. And at the end, they'll have to vote, not on what's politically convenient, but on what the evidence demands and what the Constitution requires. Some of them will make history with their votes. Some will break with their party, some will probably end their political careers, and some might save them by being on the right side of a historic reckoning. The crowds outside will keep chanting. The media will keep broadcasting. The pressure will keep building. And at the center of it all, Donald Trump will have to make the most consequential decision of his political life. Does he fight? Does he negotiate? Does he accept whatever outcome the constitutional process produces? His entire career has been defined by never backing down, never admitting defeat, never accepting outcomes imposed by others. But this isn't a business deal or a political campaign. This is the constitutional machinery of the United States government, and it doesn't care about negotiation strategies or media cycles. It operates on its own logic, its own timeline, its own inexorable momentum. Fighting may not work this time, and if it doesn't, the presidency of Donald Trump will end in a way that no presidency has ever ended before. Not through election defeat, not through resignation under threat, but through the full, formal, constitutional process of impeachment and removal. History being written in real time, with all of us as witnesses.